Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm doing something a little different and just looking at only 4 issues of the Uncanny X-Men, issues 235 to 238. A little saga that I'm calling Genosha. I'm doing this because these 4 issues are the very important setup that goes into the story Extinction Agenda, which I plan to cover next. I would have to cover these issues to explain that story one way or another, and to save myself and you from probably having another 30+ minute video, I thought I'd cover this story first and move on to that one in a separate video. We'll see how it goes. You can consider this Extinction Agenda Part 1 if you like. So let me set the stage now for this story. You see, after the Fall of the Mutants event, the X-Men were thought by the world to be dead, because they did in fact die. But since their sacrifice was in service of a cosmic chess game between a being known as the Adversary and the goddess named Roma, Roma rewarded them by bringing them back to life without the rest of the world knowing. That then let them act in secret against their enemies, both old and new. And you know it wouldn't be long before they had new enemies. Those X-Men are trouble magnets, you know? They immediately created new enemies for themselves when they dropped down to Australia and defeated a group of cyborg men called the Reavers. These guys will be back over and over again throughout X-Men history. The X-Men ran the Reavers out of their base and through a portal called the Siege Perilous. This portal was created by Roma, that goddess I mentioned like 30 seconds ago, and had the power to change people and give them a new life, sometimes causing them to forget their old life. After that, the X-Men faced off against the Brood, and then during that time, Madeline Pryor somewhat accidentally ends up selling her soul to the demon Sim, unlocking new powers inside of her. Though just what those powers are isn't clear quite yet. I mean, if you watched my last video, then you're awesome, first of all, and second of all, you already know what those powers are. But just for the sake of argument, pretend you don't know, because the X-Men certainly don't know yet. They also don't know that they're about to be pulled into another adventure, the one that today's video is about. So let's find out what that is and take this away. We open in Genosha! We're already there! Huzzah! Job done. Don't feel bad if you don't know what Genosha is yet, though. Nobody does. It's a secret to everybody. This is the island nation's first appearance in comic books, and all we know so far is that it's a green and pleasant land. Unless this sign is lying to us, but why would a sign do such a thing? We focus in on this guy who's running from something called the Magistrate, hoping for a better life for his baby boy. He tosses his son onto a plane just before it takes off and then leads the Magistrate away from the plane before they quickly gun him down. And that brings us to Australia, where the X-Men have made their new home, as you learned if you watched my previous video. Or just the intro, I guess. Same thing. It's also where the plane carrying the baby ended up, and it's the current home of this woman named Jennifer Ransom. Cool name. Jennifer is a nurse, and she's flying into an emergency with Madeline Pryor as her pilot, since that's what Maddie's job was before a certain one-eyed man came in and ruined her entire world. Men, am I right, ladies? Only there is no actual medical emergency, it was a fake out called in by these 3 called the Press Gang. The comic will be pretty secretive about who the Press Gang is exactly for some time, but I'll go ahead and give some spoilers. They're mutants who have willingly dedicated their lives to serving the Genoshan government and as a consequence have their special abilities put to use as a special mutant Gestapo for Genosha. More on the importance of all that later, but for now I'll say this includes the super strong Punch-Out, as well as Pipeline, who can teleport people through his computer, and the living mutant detector, Hawkshaw. Wait, Hawkshaw? Punch-Out, Pipeline, and Hawkshaw. Somebody's name doesn't fit the rhyme scheme. What are you even doing here, Hawkshaw? Jeez. So Pipeline pipes out, Ginny departs unknown, and sends Maddie along as well, for good measure, since they don't really know what to make of her as they're unable to detect anything about her. It's a consequence of being the living dead thanks to Roma. Another consequence is that they're undetectable to electronic equipment, as they'll make a point of mentioning a bunch of times in this story. Seems like that would make this teleport thing fail, since Pipeline has to use his computer to do it, but I guess not. Honestly though, I think it's pretty cool that both Claremont and Louise Simonson were already making such a point of bringing in technology-based mutant powers in a world where computers and technology were still so unusual and rare. So, IMO, Pipeline is one of the cooler inventions of the period, even if his name is Pipeline. That's still better than a certain other group that shall remain nameless. The X-Men show up to search for Maddie, concerned that she hasn't returned home, and end up tracing the kidnappers to a hospital in the city where they're looking for the missing baby. Or I guess they just grabbed the baby? It's a little unclear, but the X-Men attempt to stop the press gang either way. But Pipeline pipes in a big group of soldiers and they have a big gun that goes boom, which is enough to knock out Wolverine and Rogue, who had tried a head-on attack on their own away from the rest of the X-Men, and who are then sent into Pipeline's computer to that still unrevealed location. I'm assuming it's the city from Reboot. You all remember that show, right? Right? But even with their reinforcements, the Genoshans are still no match for the rest of the X-Men working together. And after the local authorities show up, the Magistrate foot soldiers are thrown in jail. And this gives the X-Men a chance to sneak in and psychically probe the men's minds so they can finally learn about Genosha, a green and pleasant land. Okay, I guess I'll explain what that is now. Genosha is an independent country located off the coast of Africa, described in this comic as being halfway between Madagascar and, that country. I'm not even gonna pretend to know how to say that. Anyway, it's near Madagascar. Oh, Seychelles, apparently. That's easy enough. Where was I? According to this propaganda tape, Informa tape, cause that's a thing. Genosha used to be a base for pirates. Corsairs. Until they discovered iron ore and precious metals in the island nation's mountains. Then there's a bit of history kinda skipped over that leads to Genosha becoming a wealthy, prosperous nation, green and bountiful, and moving toward being a leader in technology and development in the world. Gee, I wonder what could have happened that led to this amazing and rapid development. Rogue and Wolverine are about to find out, seeing as they wake up in Genosha surrounded by Magistrate troops and begin attempting to fight their way back to freedom. And you may notice they're also naked. Despite Claremont's love of massive exposition dumps to explain everything, Pipeline's teleportation ability isn't really explained at all. But what we learn from what we see is that he apparently can only send organic things through the pipeline. Living beings, in other words. So clothing and weapons and stuff stay behind. Except for in that previous issue where he teleported that squad of magistrates, uniforms, guns, and all, straight into the same room as him. That time he could do it, because if he hadn't, Wolverine and Rogue wouldn't have been captured and this story couldn't have happened. Very plot convenient powers. Rogue and Wolvie don't get very far since they run across a man who calls himself Wipeout, a mutant who can shut off the mutant abilities of other mutants. And without their powers, they immediately get overwhelmed and thrown into cells. Rogue's cell is number 23? That number really is everywhere. This bit then gets really uncomfortable as Claremont seems to suggest that Rogue was sexually assaulted. Some of the magistrate, in capturing her, apparently got a little too handsy, or at least so the dialogue would lead us to believe. Claremont even gives a bit of a boys will be boys excuse for it. So gross. What's especially weird is that may not have actually been Claremont's intention. Remember, Rogue's mutant power is that she immediately drains the life force and memory out of another person when she touches them. Skin on skin contact. And if they're a mutant, she also gets their mutant powers. So she's grown pretty used to not being touched by people, or a certain sensation occurring if she is touched by them, which doesn't then happen when she's touched after Wipeout wiped out her powers. So it could be they're suggesting some kind of sensory overload here. In just a moment, the narration says that all they did was touch her, so maybe that's all we are intended to think. But if so, why did you intentionally phrase the dialogue to suggest otherwise, Claremont? Pretty uncool. Whatever the reason, the action has left Rogue withdrawn, and she drops quite literally into her inner psyche, where she sees ghosts of all the people she's drained over the years, especially Carol Danvers, who Rogue drained so thoroughly that the power transfer between them became permanent. And now, with Rogue unable to mentally handle her situation, Carol offers to take over as the dominant personality. And since Danvers has army training, she's able to quickly work out an escape for her and Wolverine, and they get out of the prison dressed as guards and go on the run. Which isn't as easy as it might seem, given that without his mutant healing factor, Wolverine's age is catching up with him and he starts dying, which he kindly foreshadows for us by the occasional subtle cough, having clearly trained with Alex Baldwin's acting tips for actors. The pair haven't gone far when they run across the Engineer's son, so now I'm going to have to explain who that is. Throughout the story so far, we've been slowly learning a little of the upper echelons of Genoshan society. There's basically been two main important figures, the leader of the magistrates, who's a lady, but also not given a name as far as I know, and the Engineer, which is a word I'm forever going to have stuck in my head thanks to this comic. It turns out that in Genosha, every citizen is tested for the X-Factor gene, the one that makes people mutants, at the age of 13. Jenny Ransom, she of the cool name from the beginning of the video, was one such person. Only since her parents were in the government, they were able to switch her test results with someone else's, so it wasn't discovered right away that she was a mutant. Eventually, the truth was discovered and her family was arrested for the subterfuge. And the truth was discovered because what happens to the mutants after they're discovered to be mutants? If they're deemed to have a useful ability and they willingly cooperate with the government, they could be put into public service in places like the press gang. Otherwise, the Engineer gets a hold of them. The Engineer is one Dr. David Moreau, undoubtedly named for the title character from the island of Dr. Moreau, due to that character being a mad scientist who spliced human and animals together to create animal men. You know, a bad guy. The Engineer, on the other hand, reworks the genes of mutants that are considered unnecessary to develop their mutant power into something deemed more useful, and to make them more submissive, obedient, and stupid, which is why they have a very specific dialogue style whenever they're shown talking. Although undoubtedly Claremont also wanted it to be reminiscent of African American slaves in the 1800s, because that's what these mutants are made into. Slaves. They become wholly subservient to the Genoshan government, completely incapable of disobeying. In typical Claremont lack of subtlety, he does everything to rub it into our faces exactly what he's going for. They even look different from everyone else. All the mutants who undergo the process have all their hair removed, and they have all their names taken away and are given a number that is both branded onto their forehead and weaved into the suits that they wear. These jumpsuits are bonded to them. They cannot remove them, and they somehow handle all their bodily functions and nutritional needs. The mutants are unable to even have sex because of these suits, and instead the Engineer breeds test tube babies from DNA material gathered for selective breeding. And this process, when undergone on a human, is fatal, which is why Jenny Ransom was discovered. There are exceptions sometimes when the mutants continue to mutate after the Mad Doctor's work, which is what was going on with that guy we saw at the beginning. He was able to have a baby the old-fashioned way. His little baby boy that he put on a plane to help him escape this horrible life after the government discovered what was going on. And now currently the problem is that the Engineer's son, Philip Moreau, was in love with Jenny Ransom, probably for her cool name, and is devastated to learn that not only is she a mutant, but she is going to be engineered against her will because she has healing mutant powers. And the government has decided that it doesn't need any more healing mutants. In anger, Philip lashes out at some magistrates who, in retaliation, dress him up in one of the mutant suits and throw him on what's called the mutant train, a train that leads to a work camp. Or, you know, an internment camp. Because the mutants aren't allowed to live around normal people. When they're not needed or wanted, they're sent home to these heavily guarded camps so they can be separated from the rest of the populace and be kept under heavy guard. Wolverine and Rogue, or Danvers, or whoever she currently is, can't help their heroic natures, and they try to help Philip when they see what those magistrate goons did to him. And that brings all three of them to the mutant camp, which is where they're then discovered. Because remember how I was saying that they're all undetectable to electronic equipment? That includes them not showing up in cameras. And so when the leader of the magistrates sees them with her eyes walking around with Philip, but doesn't see them on camera walking around with Philip, she quickly figures out what's going on. Fortunately for our heroes though, right then the rest of the X-Men show up to rescue them. The rest of the X-Team, which at the time consisted of the leader, Storm, Cyclops' little brother Havoc, Dazzler, who was first introduced in the Dark Phoenix saga as we saw in my video on that story, the telepath Psylocke, luck-affecting mutant Longshot, and of course Colossus, had all been moving around the island mostly secretly, attacking here and there. It wasn't particularly important, so I didn't go into it. Once they've rescued Rogue and Wolverine, they also go to search for Madeline Pryor, but she's already rescued herself. It seems that when the Genoshans attempted to probe her mind to learn more about her, her demonic nature manifested, beginning to convert her into her Goblin Queen self as we see in the upcoming Inferno story, and she breaks free and finds where the Genoshans keep all their mutant babies. This bit right here is some foreshadowing for the next story, as remember Cyclops and Jean will find baby Nathan Summers in a similar place. And this facility also reminds Madeline of the location that Mr. Sinister made his clones, but shh, we don't know that yet. Unfortunately, no one was quick enough to rescue poor Jenny Ransom. They've already given her a number and taken away her name. And it was such a cool name too. Shame. Philip is devastated by what his father has already done to Jenny, and he decides he's going to take her and the baby and leave Genosha with the X-Men to try and find some way to reverse what the Engineer has done. Rogue, aka Danvers, and Psylocke force Wipeout to restore Rogue's and Wolverine's powers, and the X-Men force an evacuation of the giant citadel in Genosha's capital. They then leave with a parting warning that involves Havoc blowing up the citadel. Storm informs the Genoshans that they can either completely restructure their society so that everyone is truly free, even the mutants, or else the X-Men will one day return and rain destruction down on the entire country like they did that citadel. Change isn't too likely though, given that the Genoshans insist they need to subjugate the mutants in order for the country to be the green and prosperous land that it is. By making slaves out of a relatively small portion of the populace, everyone else's lives are benefited greatly, making Genosha one of the best places on the planet to live. If, you know, you're human. But whether change is coming or not, we'll have to wait and see, because the X-Men are leaving and so shall we, as we get to the breakdown. Honestly, my biggest problem with this story is probably the art. At this point in time, X-Men was a twice monthly comic, and to meet that demand, two different artists were switching off issues. And while both of the artists here are pretty big names, Rick Leonardi and Mark Silvestri, they may have been feeling rushed to meet deadline demands, because it feels like they can't keep up with the epic sprawl of this story. There's very little in the way of establishing shots, location or background framing, or clear distinctive action shots. The art just felt very muddied to me through and through, and it made it hard to grasp all the concepts being thrown around here. This was a story introducing a location to us, and that location very much then should have felt like a character in this story. Instead, it felt like both artists were doing everything they could to avoid bringing the location into this at all. Take how I didn't mention the Genoshan Citadel until the very end of the overview. That's because they made such little effort to establish it as a setting that I completely forgot it was in the comic at all. I could probably complain about Claremont's typical lack of subtlety in his writing, and I'm sure someone could and probably has discussed at length how problematic it is to so directly and ham-fistedly compare the experience of the Genoshan mutants with the experience of Black American slaves, but on some levels, I actually think it works really well for this story and I kind of like it. While the parallels are obvious to a history nerd like me, not everyone has that education. Philip is basically a stand-in for the reader, young white men who think that problems like slavery are distant problems of the past and couldn't possibly affect them. Only their entire world has benefited off the backbreaking forced labor of others, and maybe if we can show these systems to them, show how it can affect them or threaten characters they like, then they can begin to see the trends in other places. like the exploitive nature of ultra-rich megacorporations and their low-paid bottom-rung workers. Like with the mutants in Genosha, until those people are free, the land is never truly free and everything is built on a lie. Or maybe me, Claremont, and the X-Men are big drama queens. I'll let you decide. But at least we maybe got you thinking about it. So basically, I'm giving this series a recommendation level of high. While I have issues with the art, and they really could have left out even the suggestion of sexual assault, the main story is an entertaining, useful, and powerful one, and an example of Claremont at some of his best. The collected edition that I'm using for this review is the X-Men Milestones collection for Extinction Agenda, so I'll review it when I cover that story next. For now, I've probably talked enough. Thanks everybody for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm sure you're sick of hearing this from a million different content creators, but if you do all the standard YouTube things, liking, subscribing, commenting, all of that, it really does help out the channel, and I honestly feel this channel could use some help right now. I mean, YouTube has definitely stopped promoting me, but I don't know, maybe you disagree. But it could also help you if you did enjoy the video to make sure that you're around for the next one, and I hope to see you then, right here in the Comic Cave.